This is another sign of the times, a commentary and an analysis. Worldwide Energy Picture Future. From Israel, testing the feasibility of extracting synthetic oil from a large kerogen-rich rock field southwest of Jerusalem, and the high Arctic waters north of Norway to a shale field in Argentine, Patagonia, from the oil sands of western Canada to deepwater oil prospects off the shores of Angola. Giant new oil and gas fields are being mined, steamed, and drilled with new technologies. Some of the reserves have been known to exist for decades, but were inaccessible either economically or technologically. Put together, these fuels should bring hundreds of billions of barrels of recoverable reserves to market in coming decades and shift geopolitical and economic calculations around the world. The new drilling boom is expected to diversify global sources away from the Middle East, just as the growth and consumption of fuels shifts from the United States and Europe to China, India, and the rest of the developing world. Use whatever hackneyed phrase you want, like tectonic shift or game changer, said Edward L. Morse, global head of commodity research at Citigroup. These sources will dramatically change the energy supply outlook, and there's little debate about that. This striking shift in energy started in the 1990s with the first deepwater wells in the Gulf of Mexico and Brazil, but it has taken off in the last decade as a result of declining conventional fields, climbing energy prices, and swift or rapid technological change. The United States may now have the means to reduce its half-century of dependence on the Middle East. China and India may have the means to fuel the development of their growing middle classes. Japan and much of Europe may have the chance to reduce dependence on nuclear power, and at least theoretically, poor African countries might be able to lift themselves out of poverty. For consumers around the world, the new fuels should moderate future price increases. But giving new life to fossil fuels is a devil's bargain, making solutions to climate change and the development of renewable energy even that more difficult. Not only are you extending the fossil fuels era, said the director of the climate program at the Natural Resources Defense Council, but you are moving into fossil fuels that are dirtier and release more carbon pollution in the process of extracting and using them. In other words, intensifying climate change, or whatever have you call it, and quite possibly producing more extreme volatile weather all around the world. James Burkhardt, a managing director of the energy consulting firm IHS Sarah, said that competition between fossil fuels and renewable energy development was driven by the price of oil and gas, as well as by government policy. Yes, it's also about money. The unconventional boom will guarantee that the competition is strong for years to come, Mr. Burkhardt said. If oil costs $200 a barrel, that would provide more headroom for electric vehicles. But if oil is at $90, alternative, renewable energy will need to compete better on an economic basis. Deepwater reserves. The future is now when it comes to deepwater offshore drilling, which has already measurably increased oil and gas supplies around the world. In 2000, fewer than 20 vessels in the world could drill deepwater wells. Now, there are nearly 200, and more almost every month. Global deepwater oil production leapt to roughly 7 million barrels a day in the last 11 years, up from 1.5 million barrels, and now provides approximately 8% of the world's oil supply. That production could double by 2020, according to experts. More signs. Most of the drilling is in the Gulf of Mexico, off Brazil, Australia, and India, and along the west coast of Africa. But only about 10% of the world's deepwater oil and gas fields have been extensively explored and drilled. In recent years, advances in computer processing power have allowed geologists to make sense of seismic data 15,000 feet or more below the ocean floor. Three-dimensional imaging and seismic mapping are now possible even below thick layers of salt, which used to hide or blur views of untapped reservoirs. Super-strong alloys allow drill bits to go into hot, high-pressure fields. But even with the advances, risks remain, as the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster last year demonstrated. Regulations became somewhat tougher worldwide, yet they caused little more than a pause in drilling. Even in the United States, drilling was almost back to pre-Horizon levels a year after the accident. Cuba is planning to start drilling exploratory wells offshore at the end of the year, and Mexico is slowly moving toward deepwater drilling to revive its flagging oil industry. Drilling has begun in the deep waters off Ghana, and experts say they believe fertile fields exist some of the way down the west coast of Africa. The potential for new wealth could give Africa a better chance for development, although the history of Nigerian oil development, of corruption, environmental degradation, and strife. Oil sands. Oil sands have already transformed Canada into an energy superpower, and they have shifted American dependency from the nations of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries to a friendlier and more stable source. Oil sands have been around for decades, but they were too expensive to produce at large scale. Then, rising oil prices altered the economics in their favor, attracting multi-billion-dollar investments from international oil companies, including those in China. Since 2000, production has expanded to more than 1.5 million barrels a day of synthetic oil from 600,000, making Canada's oil sands the most important source of oil imported to the United States. Canada also exports considerable conventional oil to the United States, and the only thing holding back production of Canada's oil sands are environmental concerns. Much of the oil sands come from carving mining sites out of large sections of the boreal forest, an important depository for containing carbon and a breeding ground for many bird species. Refining of the oil sands, which requires the burning of natural gas, is more carbon intensive than refining of most other crude oils, despite a 40% reduction since 1990 in carbon emissions for each barrel produced. In other words, it could cause more destruction to the earth even faster, and opposition remains strong among American and Canadian environmentalists who are fighting to stop pipelines to the United States and western Canadian ports. Without those pipelines, oil sands production capacity would most likely struggle to grow. That resistance has forced the oil companies to invest heavily in research to reduce the footprint of extraction and carbon emissions. Shale. The biggest wildcard for the future of oil and gas may be shale and other tight rocks. Finding and producing hydrocarbons from these rocks has taken off in the United States with such velocity that it has already significantly altered government and corporate energy expectations. At the beginning of the last decade, the United States was believed to be burning quickly to its gas resources, and a flurry of construction began to build liquefied natural gas import terminals. But a surge in production in shale fields across Pennsylvania, Texas, Louisiana, and several other states over the last 5 years has produced such a glut that the price of natural gas has plummeted, and energy companies are proposing to convert their empty import terminals into export facilities. The new drilling was made possible by a mixture of new and old technologies. Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, the shooting of water, sand, and chemicals at high pressures to fracture hard rock, has been done for decades. Now, combining that practice with horizontal drilling, directionally guiding a drill bit for a shale reservoir, as opposed to conventional vertical drilling, has taken advantage of fields that were practically useless in the past. Hydrofracking in the United States is more than 5 times as great now as in 2006, and and the country surpassed Russia as the world's leading gas producer in 2009. A variety of environmental groups oppose the surge, saying the chemicals in fracking fluids can pollute water supplies. Temporary or permanent fracking bans have been put in place in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. Other states are toughening drilling regulations, and the industry is responding with tighter wastewater management, while the EPA is expected to complete a study on fracking next year. Also, large oil and gas discoveries began in Russia and Alaska in the 1960s, and more than 40 fields are now in production across Alaska, Russia, Norway, and Canada. Shell has been trying for 5 years to drill in Alaska's Chukchi. There are concerns that Arctic waters are vital breeding grounds for many aquatic species that are endangered or at risk, and that a whale blowout could cause a huge leak that would be difficult or impossible to fix. A paper released by the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon spill warned that a serious leak in the high Arctic would be extremely difficult to clean up. That is partly because skimmers can become clogged in ice, and spilled oil is unlikely to degrade in frigid temperatures. Anyway, the devil's bargain looks like a necessity for the United States, China, and many other countries, as the continued extraction and use of fossil fuels will come with more environmental degradation or destruction. According to the most recent estimates of the Energy Department, at current rates, world energy demand is going to increase by 50% by 2035, largely because of increased consumption in China, India, and the rest of the developing world. Renewable energy will rise as a percentage of energy used to at least 15% from 10%, but that would not provide for the growing demand. So, in other words, renewable energy must grow faster somehow, because it's about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations, and that should be a very important question. This too is another sign of the times, the end times, transition days, a time of extraordinary happenings, changes, and events. Everything that must change quickly or rapidly, and for the better. Revelation chapter 15. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels, having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. 2. And I saw as it were a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. 3. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. 4. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy, for all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. Again, it's time for all prophecy to be fulfilled. It's also called fate or destiny, and all these things are more signs.